Dennis Rader. To the unsuspecting residents of Wichita, Kansas, he was a man of normalcy, a face in the crowd. He blended seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life, never drawing undue attention to himself. He was a husband, a father, a devout churchgoer. His family saw him as a loving and responsible man, someone who provided for them and participated in their lives with genuine interest. A respected member of the community, he attended local events, shook hands with neighbors, and was always ready to lend a helping hand. His presence was comforting, his demeanor unassuming. He was, in the truest sense of the word, invisible. No one suspected. He moved through life like a shadow, never giving anyone a reason to look twice. No one knew the darkness that lurked beneath this carefully constructed facade of ordinariness. Behind the smiles and the friendly gestures was a man with a sinister secret. Rader's double life was a masterpiece of deception. He had perfected the art of appearing normal while hiding his true nature. It was a chilling duality that he maintained with meticulous care. He lived amongst his unsuspecting neighbors, all the while harboring a horrifying secret. His actions were calculated, his movements deliberate, ensuring that his true self remained hidden. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a predator masquerading as a pillar of the community. His ability to deceive was his greatest weapon, allowing him to operate undetected for years. This jarring contrast, this terrifying duality, is what makes the case of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer, so deeply unsettling. The man who seemed so ordinary was capable of unimaginable horrors. Rader's outward life was meticulously crafted. Every detail was designed to reinforce the image of a normal, upstanding citizen. He was methodical in his approach, leaving nothing to chance. He was a Boy Scout leader, guiding young minds. He took on roles that would further cement his image as a trustworthy and reliable individual, someone who could be counted on. He held a job as a compliance officer, enforcing rules and regulations. His position gave him authority and respect, adding another layer to his carefully constructed persona. He was an active member of his church, a man of faith in the eyes of his congregation. His participation in religious activities further solidified his image as a moral and upright individual. It was a life lived in the open, a life of manufactured normalcy. He engaged in everyday activities, blending in with his surroundings, never giving anyone a reason to doubt his integrity. He was hiding in plain sight, a master manipulator who used the mundane to shield himself from suspicion. His ability to appear ordinary was his greatest disguise. His story is a stark reminder that evil often lurks in the most unexpected places, concealed by a veneer of normalcy that can be as convincing as it is terrifying. The case of Dennis Rader forces us to confront the unsettling reality that sometimes the most dangerous individuals are the ones who seem the most ordinary. The acronym BTK, chilling in its simplicity, stands for bind, torture, kill. This was not merely a descriptor of Dennis Rader's modus operandi, it was his self-proclaimed title, a chilling moniker he used to brand his heinous acts. The BTK signature, a stark reflection of his sadistic desires, cast a pall over Wichita for decades. Rader's crimes were as calculated as they were cruel. He meticulously stalked his victims, learning their routines, exploiting their vulnerabilities. His methods were deliberate, almost ritualistic. He would bind their hands and feet, often using household items found at the scene. Then, the torture would begin. The torture was never swift, never merciful. It was a slow, agonizing process designed to inflict maximum pain and terror. Rader reveled in the suffering of his victims, drawing out their agony as a form of perverse entertainment. His need for control, for power, was paramount. Finally, when his gruesome desires were satiated, he would kill. Each murder was as cold and calculated as the last, carried out with an eerie detachment that spoke to the depths of his depravity. The BTK signature was a calling card of terror, a grim reminder to the people of Wichita that a monster walked among them. The path to becoming a monster is often paved with disturbing milestones, red flags that in retrospect seem to scream a warning. These early signs are often subtle, almost imperceptible, but they are there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed. Dennis Rader's childhood, while seemingly normal on the surface, was marked by a number of troubling signs that hinted at the darkness festering within. His family and friends might have seen him as just another boy, but there were moments that stood out, moments that, in hindsight, were clear indicators of the path he was on. Even as a child, there was a cruelty to Rader that set him apart. He was not like other children. There was a coldness in his eyes, a detachment that was unsettling. He seemed to take pleasure in the suffering of others, a trait that would only grow stronger as he aged. Animals often seen as innocent and vulnerable became the target of his sadistic curiosity. He would trap stray animals, subjecting them to unimaginable torture. These acts of cruelty weren't mere boyhood indiscretions, they were chilling foreshadowing of the monster he would become. As Rader grew older, his disturbing behavior escalated. He developed a fetish for women's underwear, stealing undergarments from neighbors and even his own family members. This behavior, often dismissed as harmless or even humorous, was a clear indication of his distorted views on sexuality and his growing obsession with control and domination. There were other signs too, an obsession with knots and ligatures, a fascination with true crime and detective magazines. These seemingly disparate interests, when viewed through the lens of his later crimes, formed a disturbing pattern, a mosaic of warning signs that tragically went unnoticed or ignored. The seeds of darkness sown in childhood had taken root, slowly twisting him into the monster known as BTK. His actions were not random, they were the result of a deeply ingrained pathology, a darkness that had been growing within him for years. As he entered his teenage years, Rader's behavior became more erratic and more dangerous. He began to stalk women, watching them from the shadows, fantasizing about the control he could exert over them. His fantasies grew darker, more violent, and he began to plan how he could turn these fantasies into reality. His fetish for women's underwear was not just about the thrill of stealing, it was about power and control. He would wear the stolen garments, imagining himself as his victims, feeling the power he held over them. This behavior was a clear sign of his growing obsession with domination and control. His obsession with knots and ligatures was another troubling sign. He would spend hours practicing different types of knots, perfecting his technique. This was not just a hobby, it was a preparation for the crimes he would later commit. His fascination with true crime and detective magazines was also a clear indicator of his dark interests. He would read about other criminals, learning from their mistakes, planning how he could avoid capture. These interests, when viewed in isolation, might seem harmless, but together they formed a disturbing pattern. They were the building blocks of the monster he would become, the early warning signs that, if noticed, might have prevented the horrors he would later commit. The seeds of darkness sown in childhood had taken root, slowly twisting him into the monster known as BTK. His actions were not random, they were the result of a deeply ingrained pathology, a darkness that had been growing within him for years. These seemingly disparate interests, when viewed through the lens of his later crimes, formed a disturbing pattern, a mosaic of warning signs that tragically went unnoticed or ignored. The seeds of darkness sown in childhood had taken root, slowly twisting him into the monster known as BTK. The seeds of darkness sown in childhood had taken root, slowly twisting him into the monster known as BTK. The reign of terror inflicted upon Wichita by Dennis Rader, the self-proclaimed BTK, spanned over a decade, leaving a trail of heartbreak and fear in its wake. His moniker, BTK, stood for Bind, Torture, Kill, a chilling summary of his modus operandi. Rader's ability to blend into the community, living a seemingly normal life, only added to the horror. He was a family man, a church leader, and a compliance officer, hiding his monstrous alter ego behind a mask of normalcy. His victims, often chosen at random, were united in their horrifying fate at the hands of a cunning and merciless killer. The randomness of his attacks meant that no one felt safe. People began to take extra precautions, locking their doors and windows, and looking over their shoulders, fearing they might be next. The Otero family, Joseph, Julie, Josephine, and Joseph Jr., became Rader's first victims in 1974. The brutality of their murders was unprecedented in Wichita. Joseph and Julie were found bound and strangled, while their children, Josephine and Joseph Jr., met similarly horrific fates. The community was left in shock, unable to comprehend the savagery of the crime. Their murders, as shocking as they were brutal, sent shockwaves through Wichita. The media coverage was extensive, with headlines screaming the gruesome details, further instilling fear in the hearts of the residents. The police were under immense pressure to catch the perpetrator, but Rader was meticulous, leaving behind little evidence. The meticulous manner in which their lives were taken, the chilling discovery of their bound bodies, marked the beginning of a nightmare for the city. Rader's methodical approach to his crimes made him a formidable adversary for law enforcement. He took his time, ensuring that every detail was perfect, every knot tied just right, every scene left in a state of eerie calm. 4 years later, in 1978, Rader claimed the life of Shirley Vian, Her murder was as calculated and cold-blooded as the Otero family's. Rader had a pattern, a ritual that he followed, and Shirley Vian was unfortunate enough to become part of it. Found bound and strangled in her own home, her murder further fueled the growing sense of panic in Wichita. The community's fear was palpable, with residents feeling the weight of the invisible threat that loomed over them. The police were working tirelessly, but Rader's ability to evade capture only added to the city's anxiety. The city was on edge, haunted by the knowledge that a predator lurked among them. Neighborhood watch groups were formed, and people began to take their safety into their own hands. The sense of community was strong, but so was the fear that anyone could be the next victim. Rader's reign of terror continued with the murders of Nancy Fox in 1977, a young woman with a bright future ahead of her. Her life was cut short in a manner that had become all too familiar to the residents of Wichita. Maureen Hedge in 1985, a beloved neighbor and friend, whose death left a void in her community. Her murder was a stark reminder that Rader could strike at any time, and no one was safe. And Vicki Wagerly in 1986, a young mother whose life was brutally taken, leaving her family and friends devastated. Each of these murders was a calculated act of violence, designed to instill fear and assert Rader's control over the city. Each victim, each crime scene, bore the chilling hallmarks of the BTK signature. The letters he sent to the police and media, taunting them with his crimes, only added to the terror. He enjoyed the game, the cat-and-mouse chase, and the power he held over the city. The city of Wichita held its breath, living in the shadow of a killer who seemingly vanished into thin air after each gruesome act. The fear was ever present, a dark cloud that hung over the city, as residents waited for the next strike, hoping and praying that it would never